Welcome to Lectures by Lobezy. Today we're going to be discussing the Treaty of Versailles, talk about President Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. We'll look at the final drafting of the Treaty of Versailles, some of the major provisions of it. We'll look at how it changed the map of Europe. Some of the criticisms or weaknesses will be addressed as well. And kind of mixed in with all of that, we'll discuss how World War I had an impact on Western society. So after the war ends on November the 11th, 1918, remember that's Armistice Day, or today it's known as Veterans Day. The President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, made a decision to go to Paris, where they were going to be drafting a treaty. He wanted to represent the United States himself. And when he arrived, he was quite popular because the United States is, credited with helping win the war for the Allied powers. So he had a lot of sort of leverage and what we would call political capital. And he was very interested in sort of influencing the decisions that were made at the Treaty of Versailles. So while the war, or just before the war had, or as the war was ending, and through the treaty process and even beyond, the world was struck by something known as the Spanish flu, in part because that's where they believed it originated from. It was a worldwide pandemic, which the world is dealing with during the time of the filming of this video, known as the coronavirus or the COVID-19, or some people have even named it the Wuhan virus because it comes from China, Wuhan, China. But at any rate, the Spanish flu is responsible as a pandemic for taking the lives of 50 million worldwide, somewhere approximately in that range, including about 675,000 Americans. All right, so the world, this pandemic just sort of underscores the tremendous crisis the world was facing during this time. Most of Western Europe was destroyed. Well, much of Europe was destroyed, but if we look at the area specifically where the Western Front was, that area was bombed out because of all the fighting that took place, and certainly certain other areas in Europe, including the Eastern Front as well. The Allies were sort of in the mood of blaming the Central Powers, primarily Germany, for the damage that was inflicted upon them, and they were looking for revenge. They were looking, to sort of make Germany pay for all that they had caused. All right, so what we see is the collapse of some governments, some empires. So if we look at Russia, the Russian Empire under the Romanov czars, or the Romanov dynasty, that collapsed. Germany no longer was a monarchy. It will become a republic. Austria-Hungary is broken up, and so too is the Ottoman Empire. All right. During that time, there was a lot of political radicals who looked to create some new forms of government across the world, either communist or socialist. We've discussed previously in this course socialism, but we haven't spent a lot of time looking at communism, or during the time it was known as Bolshevism. That will be discussed later. All right. So, as I said, President Wilson came to Paris because he wanted to put his stamp of approval, or he wanted to influence and help shape the document itself. And one of the things that he was eager to do was make sure that Germany, or the Central Powers, would not be punished too harshly, and I'll talk about that in just a moment. But there were 14 ideas that he had, and if we look at them, we can kind of chunk them. The first 5 points: open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, removal of economic barriers, reduction of armaments, and the adjustment of colonial claims. Sort of address all of the things that actually caused the war. So if we go back to the first video on this topic, World War I, we discussed mania. Remember, militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and also assassination. Those were the causes of the war. So really what Woodrow Wilson was looking to do was create a lasting peace. Okay, and what better way to do that than address those specific things that actually caused the war in the first place. Okay, so that is important. All right, so another point dealt with self-determination. Actually, points 6 through 13 dealt with something known as self-determination, and that is the various ethnic groups, nationalities that exist all throughout Europe, sort of wanting their own country. And so what the Treaty of Versailles attempted to do was to give them a voice so that they could make that decision. All right, and what we'll see is throughout Europe, 9 new countries will be created, or nation states, and these are all based on ethnic lines. Okay, so we'll discuss that a little bit more. Point 14, super important because it deals with a peacekeeping organization. All right, and what we're going to find is this was Woodrow Wilson's most important. All right, so if we had to boil it down to which one was the most important point for maintaining lasting peace, it was this. He wanted to create a League of Nations so that collective security could be used to prevent future wars from breaking out. So the Paris Peace Conference begins in January 1919, all right, and it's going to go from January all the way through the summer, okay? And as you can see, many countries were invited, but really there were 3 that were the most influential when it came to the decisions that were made there. They're known as Woodrow Wilson was one of the United States. George Clemenceau of France and David Lloyd George of Great Britain was the third. At the bottom here we see the term Big Four. It represents those 3 countries plus Italy. Okay, and so we can see a picture of them right here, but it looks like my head is superimposed over David Lloyd George's head, the representative of Great Britain, the Prime Minister. No, actually, no. My head is superimposed over Woodrow Wilson, the U.S. president. Okay, so this guy right here is Vittorio Orlando of Italy. This is George Clemenceau of France, and this is David Lloyd George of Great Britain, Prime Minister of Great Britain. And so collectively, those were known as the Big Four. So Wilson urged peace without victory. So instead of to the victor go the spoils, the winners shouldn't get anything, okay? Because he wants to prevent revenge, or a sense of bitterness. So if you punish the losers too harshly, they might want revenge, and then that can certainly be cause for future war. The other Allied leaders, especially Great Britain and France, they wanted to make money off the war, if you will. They wanted to be compensated for the damage that the war had caused their 2 countries, which, is fine. I mean, that's to be expected. But they were not going to be as willing to the concept of peace without victory as was Woodrow Wilson. All right. Part of the reason might be because of the losses that they incurred. So it's easy for the United States to say that, there should be peace without victory, because if you look at this chart here, we really didn't suffer the drastic losses and casualties and deaths that the other countries had. All right. And so, we can see from this chart that Russia and France suffered very, very heavily. Okay, and so France is really going to lead the charge for the position, the argument that Germany should be punished, that they're to blame and they should be punished. And so that is something that their president or their premier Clemenceau is going to stress all throughout the peace conference process. Okay, so what we realize is that, or what ends up happening is that Woodrow Wilson is forced to compromise on a lot of those ideas as far as peace without victory. And we'll see just all of the things that he was forced to compromise. And we'll see also what he got in the end. So June 28, 1919 is when the actual treaty is signed. It's noteworthy that it marks the 5-year anniversary to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which took place on that same date in 1914. The German delegation was shocked and horrified because of the harsh treatment that they received by the treaty, but they were sort of forced to sign it because while the whole treaty process was going on, the barricade or the boycott or the blockade, excuse me, is the correct term, by the British Navy was still in place. And so, that they were sort of being forced to sign the treaty because by the British Navy, all right? And so they felt that they were under sort of duress when they signed the treaty, all right? One of the biggest provisions is that they were held financially responsible, and that is Germany, all right? Not just the Central Powers, but specifically Germany. They're sort of seen as the main culprit. So they were instructed to pay over $30 billion in reparations, which is called a war indemnity. But if it was to be factored in for inflation, by today's number, it'd be somewhere just shy of $3 trillion. So it was quite expensive. And this is for a country that was financially ruined anyway because the war was so costly to them. Some other important provisions of the treaty go into dealing with their military, limiting the number of soldiers that they could have, so they could only maintain a 100,000 man army, no air force, no navy. Okay, and then we look at territorial losses that Germany suffered. Okay, and so I'll go through these with you. So the war sort of was started. Not one of the big things that caused the hatred between Germany and France was the seizing of Alsace-Lorraine in the Franco-Prussian War. So that territory is going to go back to Alsace-Lorraine is going to go back to France. A little territory here is going to be ceded to Belgium. This area here, known as the Rhine Valley, is going to be occupied, part of it, and demilitarized, meaning that the German military can't be present there whatsoever. And that was to sort of create like a buffer zone for the French. They lose some territory to Denmark. Down here, they lose some territory to Czechoslovakia. That's known as the Sudetenland. And then this area right here is known as the Polish Corridor. And so Poland is going to be a newly formed or formed again country, and to give them access to the sea so that they aren't a landlocked country, they take territory away from Germany and give it to Poland. And so it's sort of odd, but this here is called East Prussia. It's actually part of Germany. It's just not connected with the rest of the country. All right, so these are all the territorial losses that they had to deal with. They were stripped of all of their foreign overseas colonies as well. Okay, so it was quite strict or strong and harsh. Probably worst of all was the symbolic Article 231, known as the War Guilt Clause, that said that they were morally responsible for all the death and destruction that the war had caused. And incidentally, that's the one that seemed to sting the most for the German people when they finally learned that what the treaty contained, what the writing of the treaty was. So they signed it June 28, 1919, as I mentioned earlier. Okay, so Right here, we can see there are a number of countries. My head is kind of in the way. Apologize for that. I can move that down here. Or how about over here? Okay, so we have Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. All right, these three countries here are known as the Baltic states, but not Finland. Okay, so these four get their they become because of self-determination, they become new nation states, and that's carved out of mostly Russia. And then Poland becomes a country, and as I already mentioned, part of their territory comes from Germany, but also part of it comes from Austria-Hungary and also Russia. Czechoslovakia becomes a country. Austria and Hungary are, they used to be that empire, Austria-Hungary, but they've now since been divided. And then that Yugoslavia, remember at the beginning of the war, Serbia wanted to create a pan-Slavic nation, so they get what they're after. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Down here, since the Ottoman Empire no longer exists, there's a new country that's created by the Treaty of Versailles, and it's Turkey. Okay, but Turkey's not in Europe, so it was just 9 new European countries, and again, it was based on nationalistic lines, self-determination. Okay. All right, so I'll just move this back over here. So the areas that the Ottoman Empire controlled, so this is the Middle East, they had to cede those territories. And instead of those territories gaining their independence, what happened was they were turned over to France and Great Britain. Okay, well, if you know anything about this region, this here in the Middle East, it's Syria, Iraq, Transjordan, which would include the country of Jordan today, and also Israel, but Israel wasn't a country back then. All right, but this area is very oil rich, and as I said earlier, the leaders of Great Britain and France sort of wanted to benefit economically from the war, considering how much they, invested and had lost. So they hoped to sort of recoup some of their losses by gaining this territory that used to belong to the Ottoman Empire. All right, and so the argument that they used is that they weren't ready for independence, they weren't ready for self-governance. So although they're not called colonies, they're referred to as what is known as mandates, but for all intents and purposes, it really is a colony, okay? And then there's going to be some mention during this time period of establishing a homeland for European Jews, and there is going to begin there's going to be a settlement established for them, okay? All right, so when we look at the weaknesses of the treaty, there are many, okay? So referencing that mandate system, the people of the Middle East right here, they weren't granted their independence, as many of them had been promised. If you remember the story of Lawrence of Arabia, right? He was able to convince those Arabian chieftains to sort of support the Allied powers against the Central Powers to weaken the Ottoman, by promising them that if they did, that they would be granted their independence. They weren't given that, okay? So the people of this area felt sort of stabbed in the back. They felt betrayed because of that. And so these territories here used to belong to Germany, all right? And so they're going to be equally divided up as mandates and given to Great Britain and France, all right? So this is going to, create a lot of hostility with these people, towards the Europeans. All right, so this is Berlin when the news of the treaty had been released and reached Berlin. And so this is a mass demonstration of the people who are angry with their government, their newly established government. It's called the Weimar Republic. They're angry. They feel as if they've been betrayed because many of the German people didn't even think that they were losing the war to begin with. And then secondly, they can't understand why their governmental officials would agree to such harsh terms. So, the German people feel as if that their government has sold them out. Okay, and so what happens as a result of that is this sort of saying that becomes more and more popular as people begin to utter it, and that is that they were stabbed in the back, that the German people were stabbed in the back by their government. Okay, and so then a conspiracy theory sort of evolves out of this, and the conspiracy is that their new government was comprised of Jews who came, that served on the Weimar Republic, and that the international Jewry, Jewry, wanted to, destroy Europe so that they could come in and take over afterwards. But that, at the very least, they were upset with their government for that. So if we look at the Paris Peace Conference, the one good thing was the creation of the League of Nations, 40 nations sort of standing together. But unfortunately for the United States, or for the legacy of the Treaty of Versailles and also the League of Nations, the United States refused to join it because they felt as if the Senate, before ratifying it, didn't like the fact that they would be required to send troops in the future across the sea to Europe if they were beckoned by the League of Nations. All right, so that's going to do it for this video. All right, thanks for watching.